It is one of the most universally frustrating and deeply misunderstood experiences in early parenthood. You are standing at a crowded family gathering, holding your beautiful baby closely to your chest. Suddenly, without warning, the baby goes incredibly rigid. They throw their tiny head backward, stiffen their legs, and violently arch their entire spine, actively pushing away from your body with astonishing full-body force. Everyone in the room immediately stops talking and watches the deeply uncomfortable struggle. You can feel your face reddening as a well-meaning relative chuckles and cheerfully declares, "Well, somebody clearly doesn't want to be held right now." In that incredibly public, vulnerable moment, the exhausted parent inevitably internalizes the physical movement as a distinct, agonizing form of personal rejection. You feel like your own child is violently pushing you away, but that intense, rigid backward arch is absolutely not an emotional rejection of your love. Your infant's rapidly developing motor system is actually attempting to say something incredibly specific, urgent, and vital. The baby is speaking loud and clear. The real problem is simply that absolutely nobody in the room knows how to properly translate the language. That violent back arch is a complete, perfectly articulated sentence, and you are finally about to learn exactly how to fluently read it. To successfully decode this deeply mysterious physical behavior, you have to fundamentally change how you view your infant's tiny body. You must stop looking at the sudden backward arch as a random, erratic contraction of muscles or a moody temper tantrum, and start looking at the baby's entire physical frame as an incredibly sophisticated, highly sensitive biological dashboard. On a car dashboard, the exact same red warning light might illuminate for entirely different engine problems, depending entirely on the specific context of when you are driving. The infant back arch operates on the exact same brilliant principle. It is one identical red warning light, but it actually has four completely distinct physiological origins. It can brutally trigger during or immediately after a feeding. It can violently trigger during highly stimulating, noisy environments. It can suddenly trigger after prolonged static holding, or it can intensely trigger during an overstimulating face-to-face interaction. The physical muscular movement looks exactly identical to the untrained eye in all four scenarios. But the underlying physiological cause changes absolutely everything about how you must respond. The parent who finally learns to meticulously read the unique context surrounding the arch officially learns how to accurately read the baby. To truly master this vital translation, we have to bridge the clinical psychology of infant nonverbal communication with the hard, structural neuroscience of the human motor system. In developmental psychology, the foundational theory of nonverbal communication explicitly states that long before language develops, the physical body literally is the language. Specific motor patterns are the distinct vocabulary words, and the environmental context provides the critical grammar. The infant back arch is functionally equivalent to an adult urgently shouting a complete, complex sentence. The parent's biological job is simply to supply the correct translation. Now, let us meticulously break down the four specific neurobiological translations. The first and most intensely medical is the feeding arch. When a baby arches violently during or immediately after eating, you are likely witnessing gastroesophageal reflux, sometimes clinically referred to as Sandifer syndrome. From a neuroanatomical perspective, the esophagus and the spinal extension muscles are deeply connected via the complex auriculotemporal nerve network. When highly acidic stomach contents painfully breach the fragile esophagus, the baby instinctively throws their head and spine backward because that specific biomechanical posture actually physically elongates the esophagus and temporarily reduces the searing pain. The arch is quite literally an active pain relief strategy. The second translation is the brutal sensory overload withdrawal. When the sheer volume of tactile, visual, auditory, and vestibular input in a crowded room violently exceeds the processing threshold of the infant's immature somatosensory cortex, the brain hits a critical limit. The overwhelmed motor cortex instantly generates massive spinal extension as the absolute quickest pre-verbal equivalent of desperately screaming, "Stop!" It is an emergency brake for sensory processing. The third translation is simple postural strain. Consider the heavy biomechanics of infant spinal loading in our most common holding positions. An infant being held statically against a chest for 30 minutes experiences significant, accumulating thoracic and lumbar tension. The sudden backward arch is not a rejection of the person holding them. It is an incredibly vital, beautifully designed active stretch required to temporarily relieve deep muscular strain along the developing spine. The fourth and most incredibly subtle translation involves polyvagal autonomic mismatch. When a loving, incredibly intense face-to-face interaction simply overwhelms the infant's delicate ventral vagal engagement state, the massive sympathetic nervous system aggressively kicks in. This sudden sympathetic activation produces intense postural rigidity and spinal extension as a foundational part of the ancient fight-or-flight motor repertoire. The baby is not furiously fighting you. The baby's deeply ancient biological dashboard is simply flashing a massive red warning light, indicating that the current system is totally overwhelmed. Understanding these four brilliant physiological mechanisms is absolutely crucial because of the sheer terror that reliably occurs when a confused, exhausted parent inevitably turns to the internet for basic answers. We all intensely know the midnight Google panic. A terrified mother or father types, "Why does my baby constantly arch their back?" into a search bar at 2 a.m. The algorithmic results that immediately flood the glowing screen are the stuff of absolute neurological nightmares. The first pages furiously list cerebral palsy, severe autism spectrum profiles, catastrophic neurological damage, and incredibly rare, devastating seizure disorders. The exhausted parent's cortisol spikes to an absolute maximum. The terrifying sleepless spiral violently begins. We absolutely must address this massive digital fear-mongering directly with hard clinical reality. The vast, overwhelming majority of back-arching episodes in otherwise healthy, normally developing infants are entirely rooted in brilliant, adaptive physiological communication, not devastating neurological pathology. However, context remains the absolute key to safety. There are absolutely specific critical red flags that strictly warrant immediate, professional medical attention. If the arching is consistently asymmetric, pulling violently to only one specific side, if the rigid arching is frequently accompanied by distinct, uncontrollable eye-rolling or vacant staring, or if the intense arching is constantly paired with total feeding refusal and dangerous weight loss, you must absolutely consult a pediatrician immediately. But you must fiercely learn to distinguish between healthy, adaptive communication arching, which is incredibly common, highly contextual, and variable throughout the day, and true concern arching, which is brutally persistent, stereotyped, and accompanied by other severe neurological symptoms. The arch is almost always just a word, not a disease. Once you successfully banish the midnight internet panic, you can finally learn exactly how to accurately read the delicate dashboard in real time. The ultimate diagnostic tool in every single frustrating case is not staring blindly at the physical arch itself, but meticulously observing absolutely everything that surrounds it. You have to begin asking yourself exactly when the red light is flashing. If the baby violently arches during, or specifically within 30 minutes after a full feeding, immediately look for other distinct signs of reflux, gently adjust their feeding posture to be more upright, and fiercely commit to keeping their fragile spine vertical for an extended period after the bottle or breast. If the exact same arch wildly occurs when you enter a highly stimulating, aggressively loud environment with flashing lights and passing strangers, immediately reduce the overwhelming sensory input, swiftly turn them away from the chaos, and calmly move toward a significantly quieter, darker space. If the stiff arch happens after prolonged, static holding in the exact same position on the couch, listen to the deeply screaming muscles. Quickly shift their physical position. Try an entirely different ergonomic hold. And generously give their tired, developing spine a much-needed break from gravity. And finally, if the rigid back arch defensively triggers during a highly intense, deeply loving face-to-face play session where you are making massive expressions and loud noises, immediately respect the autonomic boundary. Step back, actively reduce the intensity of your engagement, lower the volume of your voice, and patiently let the baby's tiny nervous system set the new pace of the interaction. The infant body flawlessly provides the rigid sentence. The surrounding context beautifully provides the precise, actionable meaning, If you take absolutely nothing else away from this extensive neurobiological deep dive into infant body language, please deeply, permanently internalize this one incredibly profound, all beautiful physiological truth. Your incredibly frustrating, rigid, beautiful baby's rigid little body is absolutely not aggressively fighting you. It is simply, urgently, beautifully talking to you. Every single violent backward arch, every frustrated physical push against your own warm chest, every seemingly rigid, uncomfortable, unyielding moment is actually a perfectly articulated, incredibly honest word in an ancient, vital biological vocabulary that completely and remarkably predates spoken human speech by hundreds of millennia. Stop taking the frustrating physical movement as a devastating, heartbreaking personal insult from your own child, and start fiercely treating it as the brilliant, perfectly designed biological data it truly is. What exact environmental context reliably triggers your own baby's frustrating, rigid arch? Now that you fully confidently know, there are 4 completely possible, entirely distinct neurobiological translations which specific clinical diagnosis actually logically fits your daily reality. Go directly to the comments below right now and tell me exactly what your baby has been desperately trying to patiently say. The incredibly powerful clinical realization here is that the rigid spinal arch is ultimately just one single, highly visible word in a truly massive, breathtakingly complex, nonverbal infant dictionary. The full, brilliant neurobiological infant vocabulary practically includes a vast, stunning array of constantly flashing dashboard lights that most completely exhausted, deeply stressed parents completely organically miss. Consider the violently clenched, rigid, white-knuckled tiny fists that slowly and miraculously relax muscle by muscle as a warm bottle is eagerly consumed. This is simply the absolute clearest, most flawless biological indicator of severe hunger intensity. Consider the frantic, entirely repetitive rhythmic lifting of the tiny legs directly, forcefully upward toward the chest. A massive, flawless warning light, heavily indicating deep, painful lower abdominal discomfort and trapped intestinal gas. Look closely at the incredibly sudden, sharp turning away of the heavy head during intense face-to-face play. It is fundamentally not simple boredom or emotional rejection of the speaking adult, but an absolutely crucial, completely brilliant behavioral self-soothing mechanism designed exclusively by the nervous system to desperately boldly avoid impending sensory overstimulation. Observe the frantic, repetitive grabbing and aggressive pulling of their own tiny ears, often incorrectly, hastily misdiagnosed by anxious parents as a bacterial infection. It is frequently just thoroughly frustrated physical exploration or simply the intense, throbbing, radiating neuropathic pain of early jaw teething. Watch the sudden, violent outward jerking of the tiny arms, the beautifully primitive, utterly flawless Moro, startle reflex, attempting to desperately secure immediate physical safety in a suddenly unsupported, terrifying gravitational environment. Each of these incredibly distinct, beautifully designed physiological signals is a crucial, incredibly specific, perfectly calibrated dashboard light. The dedicated, observant parent who actively and patiently, painstakingly learns to fluently read this complex body language in the utterly chaotic first year of human life gains a massive, unbelievable relational advantage that absolutely no heavily printed, expensive parenting book can ever possibly match. They are finally truly listening attentively to the absolute most incredibly honest, incredibly flawlessly precise communicator perfectly magically residing inside their entire house. Send this exact video immediately to absolutely every single new parent you possibly know, completely, aggressively, urgently, because absolutely no expensive clinical baby manual ever properly teaches this vital language, but every single baby desperately daily speaks it. Return one last profound, deeply clarifying time to that incredibly chaotic and overwhelmingly loud, deeply frustrating family holiday gathering. Look closely, beautifully at the rigid baby, violently arching backward, and completely visualize the deeply embarrassed, heavily blushing parent anxiously holding them, desperately, silently wishing the floor would simply swallow them, incredibly whole right then and there. But now that you actually practically possess the master neurobiological translation key, You clearly, finally understand the absolutely beautiful, utterly perfect truth of that specific terrifying social moment. The frantic, struggling baby was absolutely not rejecting anyone in that loud, crowded, overstimulating room. The completely overwhelmed, totally exhausted baby was actively, beautifully, brilliantly speaking in the absolute only fiercely primitive language physically available to their tiny, that furiously processing nervous system. A sentence as perfectly clear, aggressively urgent, and entirely undeniable as any adult human being has ever confidently spoken in the long history of the entire world. The aggressively rigid spine, the violently thrown back head, the fiercely stiffened legs, the exact physical arch flawlessly, beautifully said, exactly what desperately needed to be clearly said at that exact overloaded, physically unbearable second. The fundamental, heartbreaking problem occurring in that crowded room was never, ever the specific physical message being urgently delivered by the tiny nervous system. The truly heartbreaking problem was simply that absolutely no one confidently standing in the room fluently natively spoke the beautiful baby's incredibly ancient native language. Until exactly right now, in this defining moment, when you finally utterly stop violently misinterpreting the natural physical movements as purely defiant behavioral problems or deeply insulting personal rejections, a massive, incredibly beautiful, deeply comforting biological reality finally brilliantly reveals itself to you. Your incredibly beautiful, perfectly healthy baby has absolutely been talking directly, intimately to you since the very first day they courageously took a deep breath of oxygen. They have been passionately, constantly delivering whole, incredibly complex paragraphs and profound sentences. They have been speaking at absolute full volume, heavily utilizing a magnificent, flawlessly designed evolutionary language made entirely of actively flexing muscle, rapidly developing bone, and ragged, desperately rhythmic breath. You were always desperately, lovingly trying to closely listen to them. You just simply did not conceptually, accurately know that you were actually magically hearing a fully structured language. Now, you deeply, finally do. And the profoundly beautiful, completely honest, lifelong conversation between a parent and a child can finally begin.